In biology, you often hear about something called a gene by environment interaction. This is a concept that really just gets to the idea that we are not solely defined by our DNA. The sequence of our genes don't just determine who we turn out to be. In fact, it's how those genes interact with all of the variables in the environment and the world that we live in that shape how we grow and how our health evolves. And so when we start to parse these two concepts apart before we think about how to bring them back together, there's some statistics to think about. We often hear about this idea that we're all 99.9% genetically identical. It's a shared DNA sequence that defines who we are as humans. And yet, when you think about the fact that our genome is about 3 billion base pairs in length, that 0.1% still leads to about 3 million differences between our genomes. So what does that mean in terms of what makes us individuals? Now let's layer on those environmental factors. There are, of course, when it comes to health, some of these obvious environmental factors over which we have some individual control, things like diet and exercise and drugs. But there are also environmental factors that are often beyond our control, whether it's environmental pollution or poverty or exposure to crime and violence. Now add those together with all that genetic variation, and biology is pretty complicated. And through that intersection of genes and environment, race is this complicated thread that we have to struggle with. So as Larry mentioned, our distinguished speakers today come from these two very different perspectives, the biological and the sociological, to think about how we define race and what it means for health and medicine as we start getting into the weeds. So tonight we're going to hear short talks from both of our speakers. Sarah Tishkoff will speak first, followed by Dorothy Roberts, and then we'll really get into a fascinating conversation about where their expertise intersects. So please join me in welcoming Sarah Tishkoff.
Here today or this evening, and what I'm going to be telling you about is what we know about patterns of genetic variation. What are the implications for concepts of race and also for medicine? So one of the things that I was taught as a human genetics graduate student is then when you think about diseases that have a genetic basis, one of the things that we tend to see is that we see different prevalences in different ethnic groups. So I'm showing some examples here that are of Mendelian diseases. That means that they are mainly caused, they have one gene that has a major effect. So for example, we know that cystic fibrosis is more common in people of European ancestry than other ethnic groups. We know that Tay-Sachs disease is more common in Ashkenazi Jewish populations than in other populations. But we also know there are differences in prevalence of what we call complex diseases, like hypertension. These are diseases that are caused by many different genes together with environmental factors. So it's known, for example, that hypertension is more prevalent in African American population in the US. Now, in order to understand why we see these differences, I want to start by talking about modern human origins. So all modern humans originated in Africa. These red dots represent the locations of anatomically modern human fossils, the oldest of which is dated to about 300,000 years ago and was found just a couple of years ago in Morocco. Now, after that recent origin in Africa, sometime on the order of 50 to 80,000 years ago, relatively few numbers of people, and that could be on the order of perhaps hundreds of people, maybe 1,000, a couple of thousand, migrated out of Africa, giving rise to all other populations around the world. So you can imagine when that happened, essentially you're sampling a subset of the genetic diversity from Africa, outside of Africa. So it's going to shape the pattern of variation that we see. Now, after modern humans left Africa, they ran into archaic populations like Neanderthals, you might have heard of. There's another group called the Denisovans who lived more in Siberia and East Asia. We now know that modern humans interbred to some small extent with these populations. And what that means is that in non-African populations, somewhere between about 2 to 5% of our genomes contain this archaic DNA. So how much do we differ? You just heard a little bit about this. If we were to look at the genomes of identical twins, there should be no difference. If we compared anybody in this room, our genomes, we should differ on average at about 1 out of 1,000 sites or nucleotides. If we compared to a chimp, it would be 1 out of 100. Mouse is 1 out of 30. Broccoli is 2 out of 3. And given, as you've heard, that there are 3 billion DNA bases, that's about 3 million differences per any comparison of genomes. This is the funny picture from Estee Lauder showing diversity amongst ethnically diverse, beautiful people. But even amongst the rest of us, very little divergence at the genome scale. However, that is not to say that differences don't exist. This is a figure that was taken from a project called the 1,000 Genomes Project. This is an initiative funded from the National Institutes of Health. They actually ended up sequencing more than 2,000 individuals from different geographic regions of the world. In gray is shown variants that are shared either amongst populations in a continent or globally. And then the colors are representing variants that are private either to a continent or to a population. So you can see that there are a lot of variants that are private to certain regions. This isn't a surprise. It's reflecting this evolutionary history and the fact that people tend to interbreed, marry other people in neighboring areas, as well as adaptation to different environments. The other thing is that this is from a review paper that was published a couple of years ago. And they looked at all of the studies that looked at genetic studies of disease risk. So trying to look for association between genetic variation and disease. 81% of them have been done in populations of European ancestry. The other 19%, those were of mainly East African ancestry. Only 4% represented all other populations in the world. I consider this to be a huge problem because I think we're losing out on knowing information that could benefit a diverse set of people. And one of the things that I noted from the time I was a graduate student was a real underrepresentation of genetic studies in Africa. And for that reason, myself and my students and African collaborators have been doing fieldwork in Africa for almost 20 years. And I'm just going to show you a bit of what that's like. We're working in very remote regions. We have to bring all of our supplies with us. We're also collecting information about anthropometric and cardiovascular variation. I return results to participants, something that's very important. We work together with our African collaborators to have community discussions about what are we doing, why are we doing it, what are the potential risks, what are the potential benefits, if any. We go through ethical review. We ultimately have to get individual consent. And then we are able to obtain biological material, usually blood, and from that you can get DNA, for example, and RNA and plasma. We get detailed ethnographic information. And then we have to process these in areas where we typically don't have any electricity, so what we've been doing is actually bringing, you can't see it here, but there's a generator that we take to the field. So I want to talk to you about a study that we did a number of years ago, but it remains the largest study of variation across Africans. We looked at over 2,500 Africans and then a large set of non-Africans for comparison. We use computational probabilistic approaches based on just the genetic data. We don't care about that self-identification to figure out the number of ancestral population groups, and those are represented by the different colors. Then what you see are these are lines. Each line represents a person, and a person can have ancestry from those different ancestral populations. So if any of you have done like 23andMe, this is the type of result that you might have gotten. So what we can see is that outside of Africa, people who self-identify as European or Middle Eastern are shown with this blue ancestry, people from India, from Pakistan, East Asia, Oceania, and the Americas. And what you can see in Africa is a lot of colors representing a lot of genetic diversity, more than we're even seeing at the global level. Clearly, this is not fitting with what we would typically think of as racial classifications. And to really drive this point home, if we repeat this just in African populations, and then we pool people together just for ease of presentation, you can see how much diversity there is on the continent of Africa. And again, you also see a lot of regions with different colors. That's indicating the fact that migration occurs and intermarriage occurs. This is part of human nature. So we don't see any discrete boundaries. Now, the other reason that we see variation also has to do with adaptation to different environments. This is from a review paper we published a few years ago showing examples of genetic adaptation to different environments. And one of the classic examples is genetic variation that plays a role in resistance to infectious disease. So many of you have perhaps heard about the example of sickle cell anemia. So this is caused by people who have two mutations in the beta globin gene, resulting in these sickled red blood cells. If you have two copies, you're likely, if you're in Africa, you're going to die before age 5. But if you had one good copy and one mutated copy, then actually you have resistance to malaria. And we can see there's a really strong correlation between the prevalence of sickle cell variant and malaria. Another example of adaptation is skin color. And I think this is important to talk about because we're talking about race. And when you ask people, how do you define race? A lot of people will say skin color. Actually, a terrible way to try to classify race. This is showing you melanin levels. Melanin is a dark pigment found in your skin. And what we can see is that we see darkly pigmented people in Africa, but also in South Asia and Australo-Melanesia. And it correlates with UV. So it is thought that when our ancestors migrated out of Africa to higher latitudes, there would have been selection for lighter skin because UV is necessary for synthesizing vitamin D. It actually is a reaction that occurs in your skin. And if you don't have sufficient vitamin D, it can be very deleterious. There would have been selection for darker skin along the equator to prevent skin cancer and also degradation of folate. That's important for proper development of the fetus. But nearly all studies were done in Europeans. So what we did is, in Africa, we used a machine, a spectrophotometer, where we shine a light under the arm, where they're going to be less exposed to sunlight. And based on that reflection, you can infer the melanin level, the pigmentation level of people. And what we found is that we see a huge amount of variation in Africa, with the most lightly pigmented people being the San population from southern Africa. They're traditionally hunter-gatherers, and they have the oldest genetic lineages in the world. We see a lot of variation, and we see the most darkly pigmented people are those from southern Sudan, who speak Nilotic languages and tend to be pastoralist. So we looked at association of skin color with millions of variants around the genome. We found 8 regions, 8 sites that were associated with skin color. And interestingly, in half of the cases, the ancestral variant was the one associated with light skin. Furthermore, most of these variants were old, way earlier than the origin of modern humans. Some were as old as 1 million years. They've been segregating variable in the human lineage. So what does that tell us about the evolution of skin color? Well, this poor chimp is missing all of its body hair because it has like an autoimmune disorder. But you can see that it's got relatively light skin, and that makes sense, right? It wouldn't need protection from the sun if it has body hair. But the idea was that when our ancestors left the forest and went to the savanna, there would have been selection for a loss of body hair due to thermoregulation, and then there would have been selection for darker skin. So in conclusion, evolutionary history has shaped the pattern of variation we see today. We know that prevalence of disease differs in ethnic groups. Genomic studies need to include more ethnically diverse populations, and we need to distinguish both genetic and environmental factors influencing health disparities, and the ultimate goal should be personalized medicine. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. It's a fascinating lens into the biological history of what we sometimes perceive as the external influences on race. But this really starts to make us question what lies underneath. And yet, we're still faced with the everyday reality of what race means to us. And to address that, I'd like to invite Dorothy up.
Good evening, everybody. Well, the question of our program tonight is, does race exist? And I would say, of course, race exists. We know that in America and other places of the world, people are classified by race, and it has a huge impact on people's opportunities, where they live, who their friends are, whether they can get a job, whether they're arrested, whether they're killed by the police. So it exists. It would be foolish to say it doesn't. But the question is, what does race mean, and who created it? Where does it come from? People used to think that race was created by God, that God naturally produced human beings and divided them into different races. And that idea that somehow some nature power created race still persists to this day. But when sociologists like me talk about race, we're not talking about some natural creation in the human species. We're talking about a social category that's invented by human beings. And an easy way of proving this is just to ask, what is the race of the people in these photos? This boy here, do you recognize him? Barack Obama. His mother is white, and so why isn't he a white boy? Well, because he has a black father, but he could just as easily be a white child with a black father as a black child with a white mother. Same with this gentleman. Here's his mother, Asian. Why isn't he Asian? Shouldn't race mean that you're the race of your mother who produced you? But no, because we have a rule in the United States that anybody with any discernible African ancestry is black. But that's not a natural rule. That's a rule that was invented by people. And I would say the same for the race of anybody. We don't know what their race is unless we look to the social rules, the legal regulations, and the culture that determines what race they are. So where did race come from? Was it created by some natural power? No, in fact, we can trace the origin of the idea that human beings are naturally divided into races to European scientists who invented this concept in order to support slavery and conquest and colonialism. They needed an explanation at the time, partly to apologize for Christian principles that were obviously being violated by making human beings property, and also to justify the domination of Europeans over other people. And so they invented the idea that there was this natural division of human beings, and that natural division explained why some people had more power than other people, why Europeans could enslave Africans, could exterminate Native Americans, etc. Thomas Jefferson was one of these racial scientists. He had to explain why in a nation founded on liberty and democracy you could enslave people, and why black people shouldn't be part of that democracy. And he explained it by inventing racial differences. He said it's based on the distinctions that nature has made, not distinctions that power created, but he put the blame on nature. Now, medicine has played a huge role in perpetuating this false idea that nature, whether we call it God, whether we call it evolution, whether we call it some other mystical power, divided human beings into races. The medical profession promoted the idea of the biological concept or racial concept of disease, the idea that people of different races have different diseases and experience common diseases differently. One of the chief promoters of this idea was Samuel Cartwright, who was trained right here in Pennsylvania at the University of Pennsylvania, and he promoted the idea that black people had peculiar diseases that made it better for them to be enslaved. In other words, slavery was good for Africans, he said, for medical reasons. That idea that black people are biologically distinct from from all other human beings continues in medicine. This is a recent blood test that shows that, if you look here, the part that's in red, that the test for kidney disease, glomerular filtration rate, actually produces a different result if the patient is African American than if the patient is any other race. And even the spirometer that Samuel Cartwright helped to perfect in some versions has a different reading for African Americans based on race, based on the myth that black people's lung capacity is lower than other human beings' lung capacity. Now, some doctors will say, well, we want to use race in order to treat our patients better. It improves medicine, but in fact, there are lots and lots of ways in which race medicine leads to misdiagnoses of patients and inferior care. And one of those examples is the well-documented phenomenon of doctors undertreating black patients for pain. A recent study just published in 2016 found that residents at the University of Virginia believed things like black people have thicker skin than white people, black people have less sensitive nerve endings, and this explained why they were more likely to undertreat black people for pain. Now, at the mapping of the human genome, it seemed as if the kind of information that Dr. Tishkoff has just told us about the huge variation within Africa, the history of human evolution would finally put to rest this idea that human beings are naturally divided into races. But instead, there was an increase in interest among some scientists to discover genetic differences between races. And in fact, in the New York Times, Nicholas Wade in particular published lots of stories about the search for these differences that actually exist between races. I studied this and wrote a book called Fatal Invention, where I document this trend of defining race as a genetic grouping and how these genetic explanations were used to justify continued racial inequalities, social inequalities in America. And I also point out that this false thinking about race as a biological category has been used in race-specific products. One of those products is race-specific medicine. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, has actually approved a drug for heart disease or heart failure that is specifically labeled for African American patients. And it's based on the idea, without any proof whatsoever, that for some reason this drug worked better for black people because of some kind of underlying genetic difference. So the chair of the committee said that they were using race as a surrogate for genetic markers. Now, as long as there's been this idea that human beings are naturally divided into races, there have also been people who've refuted that. W.E.B. Du Bois, for example, pointed out that the reason why black Philadelphians had poorer health than white Philadelphians was because of the social conditions they lived in. And he pointed out that when Irish were treated almost like black people, where there was discrimination against them, they also suffered from the same kinds of diseases as black people were suffering in Philadelphia. More and more research is being done looking at how racism, the experience of racism, both institutionalized racism, but also experiencing racial discrimination, has a negative effect on health, and how that's what explains racial gaps in health. So we embody racism. Race is not a biological category that naturally produces health disparities because of genetic differences. It's a social or a political category that was invented, but that does have a staggering effect on people's health, but that's because of the impact of social inequality on our bodies. So Racism produces race, not the other way around. It is not the case that human beings are naturally divided into races, and then people of different races don't like each other, and that's why we have racism. It's at first there's racism, the desire to subordinate certain people, to categorize people as superior and inferior, and that requires the invention of race. That requires dividing people into races. Otherwise, there's no reason to think of human beings as divided into races, but for promoting racism. So, in conclusion, how do we think about race? How do we attend to the social disparities and attend to the health inequities that result from racism? Well, not by pretending race as a political category doesn't exist, because it does exist. It does affect our health. It does affect every aspect of people's lives. But in order to address that, we don't continue to speak about race as a biological category and look for biological differences that explain social inequality. We should do just the opposite. We should affirm our shared humanity by working to end the social inequalities that are preserved by the political system of race. Thank you.
So thank you, Dorothy. And you both raised so many questions. I have a few of my own that I want to start our conversation off with. But I invite you to please add your questions to the conversation. You can email us at speakerseries@fi.edu or tweet at us with #TalkFI. I wanted to start by digging in a little bit more into some of the examples that you talked about. You both mentioned some examples where our social categorization by race has sometimes obscured the underlying health factors. So for instance, Sarah, you mentioned sickle cell disease as an example that we often perceive as something that's more prevalent in African populations.
But it is.
And it is.
Yeah.
But sometimes that then obscures other populations who may also have that. Can you talk a little bit more about other diseases as well that might suffer from this?
Yeah, I think so it is more common in people of African ancestry, but that doesn't mean that it only occurs in, say, people who self-identify as African American, or maybe a doctor thinks that they're African American because people have mixed ancestry, right? So that's part of the problem. Is more, I would say, like a racial stereotyping saying, you're African American, it must be, if you have anemia, that it's sickle cell. There are many other causes of anemia. And also, if we look at the distribution of malaria is common in the Mediterranean, it's common in East Asia. So it may not be exactly the sickle cell mutation, but they might have thalassemia or G6PD deficiency or many other different types of variants that can cause anemia. So that's where the problem can come in. And it's much more important, I think, to ask about ancestry. So I might want to know if someone has anemia, they're presenting with anemia, where do their grandparents come from? Do they have someone who comes from Italy or the Mediterranean, elsewhere in the Mediterranean region? That could give you a clue.
Often race obscures both symptoms and people's ancestry. So there are better questions you can ask if the doctor asks the question. Sometimes doctors look at a patient and assume what race they are, and then categorically say, well, then this must be the reason they have these symptoms. Race is used as a proxy for other factors that would be better to look at, as Sarah just mentioned, ancestry, for example. It also means that not only do doctors assume sickle cell anemia with Black patients, but they also assume that patients who aren't Black could not possibly have sickle cell anemia. So that's not the case. Complicated by, as Sarah said, the mixing of people of different backgrounds, and also self-identification that may not match ancestry. So as I pointed out, Tiger Woods, for example, has mostly Asian ancestry. But if he's identified as Black, and let's say there is some illness that is more common among people of Asian ancestry, the doctor's not going to pick that up. So there's a very famous example of a little girl. Richard Garcia wrote about this in Pediatrics, a little Black girl who had persistent lung infections, and the doctors could not figure out what was wrong with her. After 8 years, when she was 8 years old, someone looked at her chest x-ray and said, "Who's the kid with cystic fibrosis?" Well, all the doctors assumed she couldn't have cystic fibrosis because she was Black, and only white people have cystic fibrosis. She was mistreated, misdiagnosed for 8 years of her life because of that. So it's important to distinguish between race and ancestry, and also not to let race overwhelm other indicators that are better at determining what's wrong with a patient than race.
So you had Dorothy, you had a slide about the drug Bidil
Yeah.
in your talk, and that's
Yeah.
a really interesting story about
Yeah.
how these perceptions can blind ourselves
Yeah.
to conclusions. Can you expand on that story a little bit, because I think it's really interesting.
Okay, so Bidil is a therapy for heart failure that was developed by a cardiologist at University of Minnesota, and he developed it without regard to race. It's a drug that is actually the combination of two generic drugs that were prescribed for 20 years without any regard to race. He figured out how to put it in a pill, and he patented it without any mention of race as well. I won't go through all the complexities of it, but he needed a new patent. And so in the second patent, he added, because he needed a novel claim, that it was a drug for African Americans. Now, his research had to do with the impact of this drug on blood vessels. It dilates the blood vessels, so it makes it easier for the heart to pump blood. He wasn't a geneticist. He had no information about genetics, nor was any information provided to the FDA, but they assumed that there must be some genetic difference between African Americans and others, either how the drug affected them or their heart disease. And so it was just acceptable to conclude that this drug worked for Black people based on a clinical trial involving African Americans, but that we couldn't know how it would work in other human beings. So some people said, "Oh, well, isn't this great? Black people get their own drug." But to me, now, and there were others who said, "I'm not using that drug just for Black people. Give me the drug for white people." But to me, it sent the message, as does that test for glomerular filtration rate, that categorically says Black people are different, so we're going to measure their risk of kidney disease differently. No matter who the patient is, as long as they're Black, they get a different reading than a white person with exactly the same amount of protein in the bloodstream. So the message to me is Black people have peculiar bodies that aren't like any other human being's bodies. And that then leads to doctors, I'm guessing that they're not intentionally trying to put their patients in pain, but doctors routinely undertreating Black patients for pain based on stereotypes about Black people's bodies. You asked me about Bidil, but it's all related to this idea that because of race, people who belong to that category, regardless of their individual characteristics, are categorically different from other human beings. And that is a very dangerous way to think about human beings and to practice medicine. And I think that was the idea behind the drug Bidil, or at least its approval. It wasn't the original idea behind it, but its approval was based, in my opinion, on that kind of thinking.
Can I add on to that? Yeah, so my understanding also was that it was more of a patent
Yeah,
That-
it was a patent
that in
issue,
order to
yeah.
patent it, they had to say, oh, it's more effective
Yeah.
than this one population. Now, my understanding is that it was effective not just in African Americans, but many ethnic groups.
Right, originally. yeah.
However, though, it is true that due to genetic variation at genes that play a role in drug metabolizing, that there are differences that exist among individuals. We've looked at it, there's a gene, for example, that plays a role in metabolizing a drug that's typically used for treating TB. And when we look at variation in global populations, we definitely see differences. And some of that is thought to be perhaps an adaptation to different diets, because these genes that play a role in metabolizing drugs, maybe in the past they played a role in metabolizing diets or something like that. So we can't ignore at the same time that differences exist. As I recall, it is true that, again, these are statistics, so they're looking at, a number of individuals who say self-identify as African American, that the drugs that were being developed at the time weren't as effective. And so it does worry me that we also don't want to leave people out. We want to make sure we find treatments that are effective in everybody.
Yeah.
And now the ultimate goal is really going to be personalized medicine, because if we had had genome sequences for everybody, and if we could figure out where those genes are, what the variants are that influence drug metabolism, then ultimately we just want to get everybody's genome and find out at that particular position, what do you have? So that's going to be sort of the next challenge, I think, in the future.
That's true, but the problem is, as we move toward that, instead of maintaining a goal of individualized treatment, race serves as a proxy. In fact, the FDA said that approving BIDL was the first step toward personalized medicine. Well, to me, I don't want a doctor looking at me and saying, oh, you're black, you get this medicine. I want the doctor to investigate more maybe my diet, my ancestry, my symptoms, and not just make this categorical assumption, which to me is antithetical to personalized medicine. The other thing is that because racism is so prevalent in our society, I mean, whether it's conscious or unconscious, because people make so many assumptions about others based on race, categorically saying that African Americans are biologically distinct and therefore should be treated differently plays into stereotypes. I think the undertreatment of black people for pain is an example. Another example is with sickle cell anemia. It's associated with black people. If you compare the funding for sickle cell, the cures that have been developed versus cystic fibrosis, it's night and day. There's been one drug developed, and black people there's a horrible problem with blacks who have sickle cell trying to get pain treatment and being told, you're just a drug addict trying to get drugs for your, we don't believe you have pain. I mean, this has been reported and documented. And so, to me, without addressing racism at the same time that we're addressing health disparities, it can lead to worse treatment as opposed to better treatment.
So I want to dive into that a little bit more, because so far we've been talking about diseases that are kind of heavier on the genetic side.
Yes.
But when you get into diseases like heart disease that are heavier on the environmental side, you do see systemic factors, that are intertwined with racism that influence health. And you mentioned some of those, Dorothy. And so, how do we approach these two types of diseases differently, or should we? How do we raise awareness of the fact that systemic racism is causing minority populations to suffer from particular health problems more, while not also advocating that for this blanket categorization for genetic diseases?
Well, to me, the answer is where I began in my talk: understanding what race is. I just think you said it is complicated, but there is a simple way of thinking about it, which is race is not a biological category. It's not a natural division of human beings. And then you can understand how categorizing people into a social category of race, where some are considered superior to others, where there's a long history of discrimination against one group versus another group or other groups, that would be bad for people's health, that's going to have an impact on people's health. And then you can address the social inequalities that are producing these bad outcomes or better outcomes for other people. Although I would argue that social inequality is bad for everybody's health. There's there's examples. I'll give a quick example, is the way in which doctors not being reluctant to prescribe opioid treatment to Black people, but being very willing to prescribe it to white people, over-prescribing it to white people, led to a problem that initially was predominantly among whites, the addiction to opioid painkillers, which led to a heroin epidemic, and so much so that the rates of overdose among white people in America has skyrocketed, and many researchers link that to the overprescription of painkillers to white people. And we know that these painkillers were marketed for white people, and they were marketed based on myths that white people were immune from addiction, whereas Black people are supposedly predisposed to addiction. So that's just a tiny example of how racism in our society, especially when it comes to healthcare, is not good for anybody's health.
Can I just also point out that cardiovascular disease has a strong genetic component. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's distinct, completely between different ethnic groups. There may be different frequency of certain variants that might play a role. But you mentioned before gene by environment interaction. So I think that's also important to try to understand. It's not just there's a genetic component, there's an environmental component. They interact together. There's something called epigenetics, where you can have modification of DNA so that certain genes are turned on at higher levels or turned off, and that could be due to environmental factors. So there can be a direct interaction.
So as I wanted to clarify one question from the audience is, Sarah, can you talk a little bit more about the genetic differences within our socially categorized racial group versus between?
Within our socially versus
so
between.
as we have our social categories of race, is there more genetic diversity within than
So
among?
I'll just give you an example where it really breaks down and it just doesn't work, which is in the US, we have a racial classification of Hispanic. Okay, now people who might self-identify as Hispanic, they have very different ancestries. So they can have varying amounts of European and African and Native American ancestry. This is a super heterogeneous, and then culturally it's super heterogeneous. And so that's just an example where it just doesn't fit. The social categorization doesn't fit at all with the genetic categorization. Now I'm trying to remember, what was the rest of the question again?
The question might have really, because it sounds kind of like Lewontin's discovery that there's more genetic variation within groups we call races than between them.
Right.
And I think that's important, and some people are shocked to hear that, as they might be shocked to learn about your research, Sarah, that of all the, as you said, there's more genetic variation within Africa than we see on a global level. And part of that, I think, the shock is that people are so used to categorizing others by race and thinking that people within a race are so much alike that you can call them members of one race, and so different from other people that you could say that others are a distinct race, that we forget how much variation there is within those groups. Right. Like you mentioned skin color. I think it's crazy that people would say, oh, skin color determines race, when Black people can be as light as white people and extremely dark, and so can people from India, for example, be that range, and people from Asia, and if you take Asia in general, we see that. How could you possibly live in America and think of the range of people who are described as Black just in terms of skin color? From Beyonce to Viola Davis. and yet say, oh, it's skin color that determines it. Someone once said, speaking about Latinx people that Beyonce and J-Lo, for those of you who are hip, that they look pretty much the same. And as many people who identify as Latinx have large amounts of African ancestry. But the difference is just what place that their recent ancestors came from, and sometimes what language they speak. But it really doesn't make that much difference in terms of their ancestry, how much African ancestry they have, or European ancestry, or some other kind of ancestry. It's just the social determinants of who we call Latinx, who we call Black, who we call white. Their ancestry may be very similar.
So I think that's relevant to another point that you brought up in terms of how in medicine racial categories are often used as a proxy.
Yeah.
And we've got a good question here about, sometimes that might be well-intentioned in terms of trying to recruit, say, diverse populations for clinical trials.
Yeah.
So how can we do that better?
Yeah.
I agree with that comment, actually, because sometimes a proxy might be all you have. So you just have to be, again, we want to make sure that we include diverse people in biomedical research. That is absolutely critical. But without binning people into categories, as you said, as being just 100% one category,
right,
and not taking into account that there's so much variation. As you said, it's actually like 85% of the variation is within populations relative to between populations.
I agree with that. I think there's a problem when race is used as a proxy for clinical indicators that doctors could determine. And instead of looking at those indicators like family history, diet, other illnesses, other physical factors, they just latch onto race or latch onto it so that it overwhelms these other factors. So it depends on what is race being used for. What's it a proxy for?
Exactly.
I think it is important. I agree with you, Sarah.
It depends on the question.
It depends on the question. So it is important I agree that race can be used as a proxy for increasing genetic diversity within clinical trials. But then, don't use it categorically to determine the outcomes of the trial. So, why are we using it?
But it could be used, for example, if you want to consider environmental social factors that are also influencing health disparities, risk for disease. So, as you said, self-identified or perceived race can have an impact on a number of things, how you're treated and,
I
risk
think
and
that's
so on.
important.
So in that respect, it can be important.
I agree.
That's true.
So as long as you're using it to represent an environmental factor and not a genetic factor.
Right, and again, I think at this point, ancestry is more important. And nowadays, when we do these genetic association tests, we can infer from the genetics alone. We don't need even necessarily of self-identified ethnicity to do these associations. People in the past used to say that it is true that there was a problem. If you had very heterogeneous groups and you analyzed them thinking they're just one homogeneous group, it could lead to false positives. It's not an issue anymore because we have ways of controlling for that using the genetic data. But if you did want to think about how's environment playing a role or that gene by environment interaction, then knowing something about self-identified ethnicity could be important.
Yeah. Well, I like to say if you want to study racism, you need to use race. How else could you do it? That's why I don't approve of the idea that we should just be colorblind and not pay attention to race at all. Don't pay attention to race in health research. But race has an effect through racism, right, on people's health. So I want to know. I think it's important that I know that Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women in America. I think that's important. I think we need to address it. But I also believe the way to address it is to understand how racism in America has affected Black women's health so that they have those bad outcomes. But in order to do that, I have to be concerned about Black women as a group. I have to document, follow them. I wouldn't have a problem with doing research to figure out why they have these much worse outcomes from pregnancy. But I wouldn't begin with a hypothesis, as many have, that there's something about their genes, or as one hypothesis said, Black race, independent of other factors, like there's some essence of Blackness that causes women to die. You know, that I wouldn't want to pursue.
So we have a question about new drugs that are being approved that are based on biomarkers that have different prevalences in people with different ancestry. Does that seem like a more neutral way to approach drug development so that we avoid some of these cases like Bidil?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that sounds like sort of getting more towards this personalized medicine. So yes, there are blood biomarkers. Everybody goes and gets their LDL tested, right? I mean, there's an example. It doesn't matter what you self-identify as. Is your LDL, is it high or is it low,
But it
right?
does, except that it does for glomerular filtration rate.
Okay.
Yeah, it does. It does. Go on.
But one thing they're doing now is they're actually looking at genetic markers. So there was recently a study came out. There's a geneticist at Harvard, and he had been doing these studies looking for association between genetic variants and heart disease. And he found that, and it was mainly looking in Europeans, and found that if you have a certain variant, you're at a much higher risk of getting heart disease. And it was pretty predictive. It did very, very well. But what worries me is that studies have shown that these don't hold up well when you look across different ethnicities. That worries me because I think unless we're doing these studies in diverse ethnic groups, people could be misdiagnosed, they could be treated wrong, and it's not necessarily because they have different underlying genes or even different pathways. It has to do with the fact that when they do those studies, they're looking for an association between this genetic variant and that disease. And those associations may not be exactly the same in different populations. They don't tag the disease as well. So it doesn't mean the underlying biology is different.
Right.
They're not effective as a diagnostic, and that does worry me.
So we've got a couple of questions here about priorities. Sarah, you brought up this idea of this goal of personalized medicine. And we've got some questions about, first of all, will personalized medicine primarily benefit white people because the research that it's based on tends to favor white populations? And also, should that be a priority when we're facing these social inequities like drinking water, and contamination, and hunger, and things like that? As we scale up, where should our priorities lie as we understand these injustices?
Well, I think that personalized medicine will probably benefit white people more because white people are more likely to have insurance and the money to pay for it, but it will also be a problem for white people who don't have insurance. Like, to me, the problem is access to high quality medical care and equally access to living conditions that benefit health. So here I might differ a little bit from Sarah in her emphasis on personalized medicine. I think that what affects people's health much more than medicine is their living conditions. And most people don't want to have to use those personalized medicines. They would like to be healthy. And the reason why we have huge health gaps in the United States and around the world isn't so much access to medicine as the way in which people's environments affect their health. So we've known for decades that the main determinant of someone's health is their place in the social structure. There was the Whitehall study decades ago showed in Britain that the healthiest people were the wealthy class in Britain, and the next healthiest were the middle class. And as you went down the social ladder, people's health got worse and worse and worse. And so we've known that. I think most people know that just by living in our society, that people who struggle to make ends meet have worse health. And it's not just because they also have less access to high quality medical care, but it's mainly because they don't have access to the conditions that are conducive to good health. And so to me, that would be the most important thing, is equalizing living conditions and opportunities, eradicating poverty, getting rid of institutionalized racism, getting rid of discrimination against people with disabilities. All of that would be my top priority. And then personalized medicine would be a goal, but not as important as the rest of it. I mean, hopefully we could do both. We could do both.
But I think one of the biggest problems with personalized medicine across it doesn't matter what your ethnicity is, we just don't know what the genetic variants are that are influencing the majority of traits. We are so far.
Yeah.
So until we even get to that point.
Yeah.
And then, as I was saying, the fact that almost all of the research studies are being done in Europeans creates a major bias. So there has to be more diversity included. And then I worry about stuff like sickle cell. Okay, we talked about that, and you mentioned that there's not as much being done in terms of treatment.
Yeah.
So that I agree with that, and part of that has to do with funding.
Yeah.
We're not seeing as much funding for sickle cell, but we are so close to having a treatment. I truly believe we are really close. There's already genetic treatments in trial. And there's people, Gerd Blobel, for example, at UPenn is doing amazing work developing potential pharmaceutical treatments. Because what worries me is that certainly in Africa, genetic, this is not going to help them when there's a gene editing approach, right? And even amongst a large population in the US who can't afford that, it's not going to help them either.
Yeah.
So we have to be thinking also about what's going to be most effective for a large group. And I think developing inexpensive pharmaceutical treatments could be a way to go.
I want to circle back to something that you just mentioned, Sarah, about trying to diversify the pool of people that we have to identify all of these variants. We have a question about the 23andMe test. We know that when you take that 23andMe test, you have the option of consenting to having your genetic data being used for research purposes. Is that an approach that can help us diversify our understanding of genetics? And is that something that we should all do and go take our results to our doctor?
You want the scientific?
I'll just tell you the consumer approach, which is what are they actually using our genetic information for? They're a commercial business, and they're using it to make money. And so, you have to ask both whether you want to contribute to whatever scientific progress comes out of it, but also ask whether you want to contribute to what we just don't know will be the result, that is guided not by a concern for the public welfare, it's guided by a profit motive. And so that's the way I look at it.
Right. I think that they can, okay, if they increase the number of diverse participants, they're asking people, of course, about their self-identified medical history and record. Now, some people in the past have argued it's not accurate enough, everybody needs to be measured exactly the same way or it's not going to work. To some extent, that's true. But there are certain things where if you get enough people in a large enough sample, you will start finding genetic associations potentially. But at the same time, my biggest concerns are the same as Dorothy, which is what are they doing with that information? Do people who are contributing know how it's being used? Do they know it's being used to sell their information to pharmaceuticals, basically? Right? That's what they're mainly doing, is selling the data to pharmaceutical companies. And now we've heard with all these cases about, what was it, the killer in California?
The Golden State Killer,
Golden State Killer,
Yeah.
and thank God that he was caught, but they found it by using these genetic ancestry tests. So there's a loss of privacy that people at least have to be aware of when you're doing those sorts of tests.
And I will add that there are also sort of nonprofit efforts to diversify, the pool of participants in genetic research. You know, that the National Institutes of Health have this initiative called All of Us that is really trying to reach out to populations who have been historically underrepresented and trying to build relationships.
Yeah.
Right, because there's a lot of fear and mistrust. And so, it has historically been extremely challenging to include minority populations in the US in biomedical research for good reason, because there are some horrible things that were done. I'm sure Dorothy could give us some examples that were really
Everybody
horrible.
knows
and
the
there's-
Tuskegee
right?
study, or I like to say the U.S. government study, because it was funded by the United States government. But yeah.
Do people know what that is? They may not. You want to tell them?
Well, just briefly, it was a study of syphilis to see how it affected Black people's bodies differently from other people's bodies, and about 600, mostly sharecroppers in Alabama, were enrolled with the promise that they would get health care, and instead they were allowed to, many of them, die from the disease without treatments which were available so that their bodies could be autopsied and examined for the purpose of this research study. And it went on from the 1930s to the 1970s before it was discovered by a newspaper reporter and finally shut down. But it's one example, probably maybe the best known example, of a long history of medical experimentation, beginning during the slavery era, but continuing into the modern times, using African American and other people of color, and poor white people as well, as guinea pigs for experimentation. Incarcerated people also for experimentation.
So this is something, this interplay between genetics and environmental factors and race is something that we've been really interested in talking to our visitors about, because it's something that's so relevant here, especially in Philadelphia, with such a diversity of people who live here. We've been fortunate to be partnering with some students and faculty at Temple University from their departments of biology and geography and urban studies who are here tonight with some activities to address some of the topics that we've been talking about outside in the lobby after we're done in the theater here. So I definitely encourage you to continue the conversation with them. But I wanted to wrap up with just a couple of questions to help us all move forward. First of all, I think this is a question that a lot of people have, is what is the difference between how we define race and ethnicity? Because we do see that a lot. And how do we use our words carefully?
Yeah.
Do
you have I don't know if you have a scientific answer for it.
No, there is.
I have a
there's not-
sociological.
Yeah. There's not a genetic, right? But to me, I guess I think of ethnicity from a cultural perspective, and again, I often think of it as depending on the questions you're asking, because I work a lot in Africa. Often it will be based on language. People who speak a similar language will often have a shared culture. Sometimes it's based on diet. We might be looking at people who are traditionally foragers or people who drink a lot of milk and are pastoralists. So to me, I don't know, I think of it as culture. How would you?
I do too. I think ethnic groups are basically cultural groups that are smaller, much smaller than what we think about races, and they can also change. Even though you might have ancestry to a particular group, the contours of the group can change over time. Whereas race it depends on, because people who define race as a biological category will say, well, it's biological and ethnicity is cultural. But as I hope I've convinced you, and Dr. Tishkoff as well, race is not a biological category, it's a political category. And The difference between ethnicity and race is that the concept of race divides all human beings into maybe 4 or 5 categories, whereas there's thousands of
right.
just in Africa alone,
Yeah,
right?
that's true.
There's
2,000 ethnic
yeah,
groups.
thousands of ethnic groups. So ethnicity to me is much more compelling as a way of describing human beings groupings, because it's much more plausible that you would have thousands of them than the idea that all human beings are divided into 4 or 5 groups. That's how could that possibly be? Billions of human beings, and yet can we really classify them into only a handful of groups? You know, to do that, again, it has to be a socially defined way of grouping them. And so race to me is a political category. It's a category that was invented to govern people, to determine who has power in a society, who can be subordinated in a society. And so far from thinking of the distinction as biological versus cultural, I actually think of the distinction as political versus cultural.
Yeah, I always think that, the problem with race, whenever I've participated in a number of workshops at NIH, for example, on this topic, and they start by saying, define race. Nobody can define race. Nobody can do it because traditionally it's an intertwining of what were historically sometimes biological classifications mixed in with social classifications. You can't, it just doesn't make sense. Nobody can really define race. And that's part of the problem. And then it's been historically used in really horrible ways, not just slavery, but eugenics, which also went on until pretty recently, 60s, 70s in this country, and the Holocaust and so on was a result of that sort of thinking.
Yeah, I think that's something to pay attention to. There's a lot of geneticists who say, oh, we can't think about that, that's too political. And we're trying to look at race scientifically. So we're not going to consider all of the horrors that have been inflicted on human beings based on the concept of race. But why shouldn't we? I mean, scientifically, if you have 300 years of atrocities perpetuated based on this classification system, why shouldn't we take that into account? So I think based on that, we should be very careful about how we use race.
And I think in today's political environment, we have to be particularly careful. This rise in, supposedly rise in white nationalism. People are actually using genetic testing to try to prove, that how white they are or something. I mean, this is something that we have to be very aware of and careful with, particularly in this time. And
sociologists are studying that, by the way. I was just at the American Sociological Association meeting. I actually organized a panel on feeling. The theme was feeling race, so my panel was on feeling genetics and race. And one of the speakers has been studying white nationalist websites and their use of genetic research to promote the idea that white people are superior and a separate race. And she talked about how they deal with some of the results that show that they actually aren't as pure white as they think they are. And usually what they do is say, oh, that's wrong. So they'll say, it's contaminated. Or they'll say, Jews and blacks have contaminated the white database. And so that's why we've got these results. But they make a big deal about genetics and race. And I think you're right. That adds to the scrutiny we need to give to the use of this category.
So in the face of these challenges, I want to end on hopefully something that people can take with them. The two of you collaborated on a paper that that really pushed scientists in the medical field to rethink how they use race. If you had a couple of words of advice for our audience tonight about how we can use what we've learned today to change the conversations in our daily lives about race, Well, what would you tell people?
Well, I would say just try to think about human beings apart from a biological concept of race. Whether you're a scientist, a doctor, a teacher, a lawyer, whatever your occupation or how you spend your life is, can you imagine that human beings exist without being divided naturally into races? That's a first step, to think about it, to understand that this was invented, and there's no reason that we should think that this is a natural creation. And then to think about instead how racism has shaped every aspect of our society, including people's health, and put those two together, those two thoughts together, and then think, okay, how am I going to practice medicine now? How am I going to treat people now? What do I want to do to address the continuing impact of racism in my country? And that would be my advice. I think that comes from our paper, because we actually said, take race out of human genetics variation research, and we proposed using ancestry instead.
Right, and I would and I agree with all of
Yeah,
that, because
go
we
on.
co-wrote that
Yes,
together.
we did.
But also that words matter.
Yeah.
I think that was another thing that
Yeah.
came out of that piece. Language matters, words matter. Particularly, I get concerned in the biomedical community. It's been very traditional that when MDs will publish a paper and they'll say, it's the worst word, I hate this, Caucasians.
Yeah, right.
And
Well, it sounds more scientific if
no,
you
but
say
Caucasian is part of a historical racial
Yes.
classification based on supposedly biological classification.
Yes.
By saying that word, you're adding to this
I
idea
agree.
that there's a biological classification
Yeah.
to race.
Yeah.
So your words matter. You have to be careful also about putting labels on people.
Yeah.
And better to avoid using these racial categorizations.
Mm-hmm.
It depends on your question. Depending on the study you're doing, the questions you're addressing, you might want to use language, you might want to use religion, you might want to use, ancestry.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of things are better than using race.
Yeah.
So we all have so many different dimensions to our identity.
Yeah, that's
that
true, too.
We just need to be more precise and inclusive.
Yes, that's what we were calling for scientists and doctors not to continue this sloppy use of the word race, where often you ask them, can you define the term, the key variable you're using in your study, because they rarely do in the article itself, define it, and they can't define it. Well, you're a scientist using this variable in your study, and you can't tell me what the variable means? We're calling for more precision and more thought put into, as Sarah said, the words that are being used.
And I think that's really practical advice for all of us. I'd like to thank Sarah Tishkoff and Dorothy Roberts for sharing their expertise with us tonight. I hope this event has given you some food for thought. Please continue the conversation with our speakers as well as our colleagues from Temple who are out in the lobby. We just wanted to give you a heads up about our upcoming events. We've got 2 food-related events in November because the holidays are coming and we're all interested in food. But on November 26th in particular, we have a really fascinating conversation that is related to what we've been talking about here, about how our senses of taste and smell are evolving and how that relates to social factors influencing nutrition and access to food. So I hope you'll join us for that if you found tonight interesting. Again, please give us your feedback on the survey that you'll get later this week. We take all of that to heart. And thank you again for joining us tonight.